In 1995, a futuristic-looking children's movie was released in theaters. It was titled simply Toy Story. Toy Story was the first feature film created by Pixar, but it wasn't Pixar's first product. That honor goes to a piece of technology named the Pixar Image Computer. The computer was the brainchild of Steve Jobs, who'd become a major investor in Pixar after he'd been let go by Apple in 1985. Jobs envisioned Pixar as the next Apple computers, with the twist that Pixar would focus even more than Apple on visual design. But over its first 2 years of operation, Pixar barely sold 100 computers, and as sales flatlined, the company spiraled towards bankruptcy, until at the last moment, Pixar was saved by a cash injection from Disney. So why did Disney invest in a computer company? Well, because as Pixar was trying to sell its computer, it made some demo films to show off the power of its technology. These short animated works caught the eye of Disney Animation, and Pixar found itself with the money to make a full feature film for wide release. There was just one problem. Disney hated the script that John Lasseter and the story team at Pixar had created, and they demanded a major rewrite. The writers at Pixar did what they were told, and the results were not good. The screen tests bombed, and Pixar was almost shut down again. But Steve Jobs dug back into his pockets to keep the lights on, and the Pixar team decided to reject Disney's notes and go back to making the film their own way. The result was the script for Toy Story. Disney's internal analysts predicted Toy Story would be at best a modest success, but Toy Story became a box office smash, grossing over $360 million and paving the way for Pixar to make more films its own way. Films like The Incredibles, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, WALL-E, and Up, which have together grossed billions of dollars and earned 16 Academy Awards. What's the big lesson of this story? Well, Pixar was started by tech heads, and they built Toy Story like an engineer would. So they consciously adopted Aristotle's method of reverse engineering, and they used it rigorously. And this method of reverse engineering allowed the rookies at Pixar to tap into a huge audience that had been overlooked by Disney, the biggest animation studio in history. How did Disney overlook this huge audience? Well, like all studios, they had a blind spot that was a natural but unfortunate byproduct of their efforts to make movies on an industrial scale. To provide theaters with a constant stream of fresh movies and to take advantage of the most profitable windows in the calendar for releasing films, movie studios want to regularize the production of films as much as possible. And of all the challenges posed by this drive to regularize movie production, none is bigger than the challenge posed by that part of the assembly line known as the screenwriter. Screenwriters don't work like clockwork. Sometimes they get distracted or depressed or their imaginations run dry. And even at their best, their greatest epiphanies come unexpectedly and irregularly, 2 weeks after the critical fourth quarter stock report deadline has passed. So screenwriting adds a massive degree of uncertainty to Hollywood's supply chain, continually threatening the industry with financial disaster. And to keep the business going, the studios therefore have a huge incentive to make writing as mechanized and reliable as possible. Rather than encouraging writers to develop creative and innovative new stories, studios instead ask them to take the less risky approach of copying what has worked in the past, asking them to crank out the same basic story structures over and over again. Audiences, in turn, end up supporting these stories because there aren't other big-budget movies to see. So we get more and more of the same kind of Hollywood script until people think that script is the only kind of script. And this really is where we get the idea that there's a universal formula for making movies. It's not that there are eternal archetypes in the human mind. It's that formulaic stories are an easy way to keep the scripts flowing and the investors happy. But the success of Toy Story reveals that even within this industrial storytelling machine, there's still room to innovate. That's because movies aren't just made for supply lines and investors. They're also made for audiences. And if you can listen to your audience and give them a story that they want, you not only make your audience happy, you make all your investors happy too. So how do you pull off this feat of corporate innovation? You do what Pixar did and reverse engineer. You cast away the current Hollywood formulas for children's movies, and then you identify a specific cognitive effect that audiences crave, but that Hollywood has been neglecting. So, what was the cognitive effect that Pixar's story engineers felt that Disney was neglecting? Let's find out by turning to the end of Toy Story's script and identifying as precisely as we can the psychological experience that it imparts. If you haven't watched Toy Story yet or read its script, now's the time to hit pause and go enjoy. Toy Story chronicles the adventures of a pull-string cowboy doll named Woody, who was once the favorite plaything of his owner, 6-year-old Andy, but who gets replaced by a newfangled Space Ranger toy named Buzz Lightyear. For most of the script, Woody tries to get rid of Buzz and reclaim his old place in Andy's affections, until at the end, the two toys open their hearts to each other and become buddies, joining forces to escape the clutches of the toy-destroying neighbor Sid and make their way home. In the final beats of the script, after Buzz and Woody have finally made it back to safety, they sit together as Andy opens his Christmas presents. The first present is a Mrs. Potato Head, and the toys all cheer and congratulate Mr. Potato Head on his new life partner. It seems like a classic happy ending. Everybody comes together for a wedding. But the script doesn't end on this upbeat moment. Instead, there's one more present left for Andy to open.
Buzz Lightyear, you are not worried, are you?
Me? No. Are you?
Now, Buzz, what could Andy possibly get that is worse than you?
Oh, what is it? Wow, a puppy!
Even though Buzz and Woody do their best to laugh, this is not the ending they were hoping for. Because both of them have just been replaced in Andy's affections by a toy-chewing puppy. So having started with a classic comic bit about Mrs. Potato Head, the script's ending finishes with a pivot towards a classic tragic ending that returns the main characters, just like in The Godfather, to the dark place where they started. The script began with Woody being replaced by a new plaything, and the script now ends with both Woody and Buzz being replaced. But even though the script seems to end right where it began, one thing has changed since the start of the film. Buzz may have arrived exactly back where Woody was, but now there are two of them sitting in Andy's bedroom, grimacing and smiling weakly together. So Woody no longer needs to look alone into the tragic truth that time is passing, that Andy is growing up, that all toys will one day be pushed aside for adult things. Instead, Woody and Buzz can look into this tragic truth together. And so, rather than being marooned in a state of tragic isolation like Woody was at the start of the script, Woody and Buzz now discover the comfort of a special kind of sympathy. As we've explored in other lectures, many Hollywood movies encourage sympathy. But typically, that sympathy is felt by one person toward another. What's unusual about the end of Toy Story is that two characters feel sympathy for each other. Buzz feels sympathy for Woody, and Woody feels sympathy for Buzz. So instead of moving in one direction, the sympathy moves reciprocally between two characters. And making this circle of sympathy even bigger is the fact that we, the audience, join in. Because although we're not literally replaced by a puppy, we carry in our own hearts the same dark truth that Buzz and Woody discover at the end of Toy Story. Someday, we'll be made expendable. Someday, the world will move on without us, and we will lose our home. Because after all, that's what it means to be a living thing. You're born, you grow, you flourish, and finally, when your time runs out, you die. At the time that Toy Story was produced, Disney's studio machine didn't believe there was a great deal of profit to be made from this honest exploration of earthly mortality. And in fact, Disney's big hit the year before had been The Lion King, which took completely the opposite approach to connecting with audiences. Instead of inviting us into a circle of death, The Lion King sang of the circle of life, encouraging a spiritual feeling of immortality. But Pixar realized that there had long been a tragic recognition of mortality in children's literature. Back at the dawn of storytelling, there had been fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood, where a girl is eaten by a wolf. And back at the dawn of movie making, Disney itself had crafted fairy tales like Bambi, where the main character's young mother is suddenly killed in the final pages. Because children know about death. They see it and they want to talk about it. It's just adults who get awkward. We don't want to spoil childhood with dark things, so we bottle it up. But Toy Story shows that there can be enormous positive power in unbottling the dark truth of our mortality. Since death is the deepest truth of human life, it can be the one thing that connects us all. And so, although there may be nothing more frightening than confronting your own end alone, there can be no greater comfort than facing our shared mortality together. This awareness of our own fleeting lives is what creates the circle of sympathy that joins us to Buzz and to Woody at the end of Toy Story's script. This is what swells regular sympathy into big sympathy as we hold hands and share in the deep impermanence that makes us all one. So now, let's see how Pixar created a script that helped audiences to accept their mortality together, so that you can lead your audience into big sympathy yourself. Like Pixar's original screenwriters did, let's reverse engineer back from Toy Story's cognitive effect to its four main story components, starting with how the script establishes the story world in its opening beats. So here are those opening beats. So the very first thing the script shows us is a row of moving boxes, which immediately tells us that this is a story world of transitions and change. People move, literally and figuratively. They relocate from one neighborhood to another. They grow from children into adults. They're always leaving their past lives behind. The second thing the script shows us is that the world doesn't acknowledge these changes as upsetting. Instead, it does its best to pretend they're no big deal. That's why the moving boxes are decorated with crayon and incorporated into a game. And why the game is a goofy Western spoof where Mr. Potato Head terrorizes other toys for money, money, money. Why this repeated emphasis on money? Because money is the moment childhood ends. Children don't understand money. There's a reason it's called cold, hard cash. It's the opposite of innocence. A child would never give up anything important for money, but lots of adults do. Yet crucially, the story world of Toy Story's script doesn't acknowledge this dark side of money. It doesn't admit that our transition into adult materialism involves a tragic loss. Instead, through the buffoonery of Mr. Potato Head, it makes us laugh past it, just like it makes us gloss over the moving boxes, treating them not as an existential threat, but as part of a game. So to live in this story world is to be propelled through constant changes, and yet to be told that these changes are not dark or disturbing, or even really changes. They're the natural way of things, as inevitable as a baby growing up. You might recognize this story world as a version of our own modern world. Every day, our world becomes something new. It fills our lives with new technologies, new faces, new economic realities. Yet rather than acknowledging how strange and wrenching this can be, our world constantly reassures us that this is normal. It tells us not to fight the future. It urges us to smile and play along, suppressing the fears and the anxieties that we all feel inside. The bigger lesson here is that if you're writing a children's story, try creating a story world with a deep problem that it refuses to acknowledge. Because that's the world that children know. A world of dark conflicts and difficulties that adults keep hurrying them past, telling them not to look. Against its story world of smiling change, Toy Story juxtaposes two main characters, Woody and Buzz. As we'll see in a moment, Woody and Buzz are both reflections of a single deep conflict against the story world. But first, let's look at how Woody and Buzz are different. Woody sees the future coming, and he does his best to stop it. Buzz doesn't see the future, and he crashes on, unchanging. So each of these characters resists different aspects of the story world. Woody resists the world's insistence that change is normal. Where the world is blind and indifferent to the pain of transition, Woody is anxious and self-aware, admitting that change can be so hard and distressing that it can even feel like a kind of death. Buzz, meanwhile, resists the idea that change has to happen at all, clutching his cardboard packaging as though it'll last forever. But even though Woody and Buzz are different on the surface, they're really two sides of the same coin, because this is how all of us resist difficult changes in our lives. We simultaneously fret about the changes and deny that they're occurring. When we get our first gray hair, we pause and worry. And then we pluck it out and go on like it never happened. Worry and denial. Worry and denial. These are two twinned expressions of the same deeper emotional conflict. Another way of saying this is that Woody and Buzz together make up a soliloquy. And in particular, they combine to give a very famous kind of soliloquy, the kind of soliloquy given by Shakespeare's Hamlet. Hamlet might seem an odd script to compare with Toy Story, but a year before Toy Story, Disney had consciously created a more spiritually sanguine version of Hamlet's plot in The Lion King. And in Toy Story, Pixar restored Hamlet's tragic uncertainty about the life hereafter by preserving the Danish prince's deep inner conflict about death. When Hamlet asks himself to be or not to be, he's torn between fighting the realities of his world and ignoring them, between taking arms against his troubles or retreating into the private peace of his mind. He's torn, in other words, between anxious resistance and oblivious denial, between being Woody and being Buzz. And like Woody and Buzz, the thing that Hamlet is anxiously resisting and obliviously denying is his mortality. There's a reason that Hamlet is still in school in his 30s. He's not ready to grow up and leave the wonders of childhood behind. But when Hamlet's father is killed, Hamlet is forced to confront the more adult side of life. That's what happens when your parents die. Suddenly, there's no one left standing between you and the final curtain. As we saw back in our introductory lectures, Hamlet's conflicted to be or not to be soliloquy is a powerful source of sympathy. And so when Toy Story splits this soliloquy between Woody and Buzz, it generates the same sympathy, only now split between two characters instead of just one. Toy Story's script introduces the first half of Hamlet's soliloquy by establishing Woody's anxious resistance. The instant that Andy leaves the room, the script tells us, Woody's eyes come to life. The cowboy doll sits up, his expression changing from a smile to worry. Then, to establish that Woody's precise worry is a concern about the future, the script has Woody summon all the other toys to a staff meeting where he demands to know if everyone has picked a moving buddy, then scolds the other toys for acting like the relocation is a big joke, and finally reassures them that he's got a plan to handle Andy's new toy. So Woody is a thinker, a worrier, a planner. While the rest of the world crashes on ahead, he can see down the road. And the more he sees, the more he wants to stop what's coming. Having established Woody's self-conscious resistance to the passing of time, the script then introduces Buzz's oblivious denial as a counterpoint. Buzz is so deeply oblivious to the world that he doesn't even realize it exists. Caught up in his own imaginary reality, he thinks that Andy's bedroom is an alien planet light years away from Earth. Once Buzz is introduced, the script now has both halves of Hamlet's soliloquy. And it then proceeds to put them into conflict, making Buzz and Woody argue and fight and plot each other's overthrow. This can seem like a conflict between a hero and an antagonist, but in reality, it's the conflict between the two faces of the same tragic hero. Because although Buzz and Woody have different bodies, they share a single experience. They're both toys in a world where childhood ends. And just as we all go back and forth on how to handle our mortality, sometimes doing our best to outthink it, sometimes denying that we're really getting old, so too are Buzz and Woody literally of two minds about how to cope. The more general trick you can pick up from Woody and Buzz is a technique for creating multiple heroes. Give them the same root conflict and fear, but have them battle their fear in different and even conflicting ways, so they seem rivals on the surface, but eventually reveal themselves to be brothers in the fight. Now, let's see how Toy Story reverse engineered its plot. As we discussed in our earlier lectures, reverse engineering involves adapting a pre-existing story structure that generates the rough cognitive effect that you want. And that's exactly what Toy Story does with Hamlet. Shakespeare's play has a 5-act structure, and Hamlet himself goes on a 5-part journey. First, Hamlet is bereaved. He suffers through the death of his father, making him feel his own mortality. Second, Hamlet's loss puts him in conflict with the world. He berates his mother, kills Polonius, feuds with Laertes, and so on. Third, Hamlet's external conflict with the world triggers an inner conflict that manifests itself in his third act, to be or not to be soliloquy. This inner conflict isolates Hamlet and makes him feel more and more alone. Fourth, Hamlet suddenly realizes that he's not alone. He sees the mirror of his own situation in Laertes and comes to accept what his mother told him back in the first act, that all of us lose people that we care about because life necessarily involves death. With this, Hamlet stops feeling sorry for himself and experiences sympathy for someone else. And then fifth, just after Hamlet feels this broader sympathetic connection with others, he dies. The plot, in other words, kills off its main character. This is the critical final step to creating big sympathy because when the main character dies, the audience loses someone they've come to care about, and so it triggers a feeling of bereavement in them. Just as Hamlet lost his father, now the audience has lost Hamlet, incorporating the audience into the circle of loss. So to sum it up, the 5-part structure is bereaving the character, external conflict, inner resolution, bereaving the audience. The script of Toy Story follows the same 5-part structure. Here's how it works. In Toy Story, the first part is when Woody is confronted by the arrival of Buzz. This displaces Woody, just like Hamlet is displaced by Claudius, and forces Woody to confront his own mortality. The second part occurs when Woody throws a temper tantrum that ends with Buzz being knocked out the window, just like Hamlet throws a temper tantrum that ends with Polonius being stabbed. The third part is when Buzz and Woody fight, and as they fight, they drag themselves into deeper and deeper problems. Just like Hamlet's attack on Polonius gets him expelled from court, so do Buzz and Woody find themselves cast out of their home. The fourth part is when Buzz and Woody stop fighting and recognize their shared mortality, just like Hamlet sees his shared situation in Laertes. Buzz finally realizes that he's just a toy, and although this is a brutally disillusioning moment, it enables him and Woody to reconcile. The tragic sense of mortality that's too much for Woody to handle alone becomes something he can handle with Buzz, and they work together to get back home. And the fifth part is when Woody and Buzz are replaced by the puppy. So they don't literally die like Hamlet does, but we see they're about to get chewed. If you want to create big sympathy in audiences, you won't find a more time-tested model than Hamlet and Toy Story's 5-part plot. So write a plot about someone who suffers a loss, driving them to rage against the world and themselves before they see that others have suffered the same loss, until in the very last moment, they're lost themselves. To reverse engineer a tone that creates big sympathy, Toy Story's script alternates between a sentimental and a comic narrator, back and forth continuously. This has the effect of turning the entire script into a soliloquy between the perspectives of Woody and Buzz. When the narrator is sentimental, the tone is anxious, worried, dark, like Woody. When the narrator is comic, it's playful, carefree, joyfully oblivious, like Buzz. One of the dark Woody moments occurs when Sid blows up the toy's friend, Combat Carl, with a firecracker, prompting the script to obliquely intone, "A large, black scorch mark is all that remains where Combat Carl once stood." This terrifyingly solemn moment literalizes the ultimate horror that Woody worries about. Childhood will end, and the toys will be destroyed. At the opposite end of the spectrum are the comic moments of narration where the script breathes with Buzz's oblivious sense of joy. Here's how the script reads when Buzz and Woody are about to be blown up like Combat Carl, until Buzz activates his toy wings, and they escape.
Hey Buzz, you're flying!
This isn't flying. This is falling with style.
Ha-ha! To infinity and beyond!
So joyful is the moment that even Woody forgets to worry. For an instant, he's lost in play again. By switching between sounding like Woody and sounding like Buzz, the tone of the script recreates the soliloquy in us, so that we don't just feel for Woody and Buzz's conflict, we feel with it. And because this back and forth of tone permeates the whole script, it does what the plot does and makes the feeling of sympathy everywhere. It's not restricted to a single character. It lives in every story beat. So if you want to create big sympathy, try this technique of alternating between a comic and a sentimental narrator, moving your audience's mind through a big script-length soliloquy. Now that we've reverse engineered the nuts and bolts of Toy Story's story world, character, plot, and tone, let's flesh out our blueprint by tackling the most challenging kind of scene to write in a script that generates big sympathy. That scene is the one where sympathy is generated between two previously opposed characters. This is the crucial moment where regular old sympathy becomes a circle of reciprocal sympathy that draws the audience in. And the great challenge of writing this scene, of course, is that two characters who are feuding rivals suddenly have to develop a deep appreciation for each other's point of view. So how do you accomplish this marvelous transformation of feuding hate into mutual love? The most straightforward way is through an old script writing trick we learned back in our introductory lectures, the trick of the mirror scene. Shakespeare uses a mirror scene to make Hamlet sympathetic for Laertes, and Toy Story does the very same thing to make Buzz and Woody sympathetic for each other. In Toy Story, the mirror scene begins with Woody trapped in a milk crate, asking Buzz for help. But Buzz is too dejected to do anything.
No, Woody. For the first time, I am thinking clearly. You were right all along. I'm not a space ranger. I'm just a toy. A stupid little insignificant toy.
In this moment, Buzz suddenly grows up. He becomes aware of a world beyond him, and this awareness is a dark and tragic one. Woody tries to talk Buzz out of his funk, telling him how great and important it is to be a toy, but Buzz can't go back to being a child. He finally sees what Woody sees. He's grasped his own mortality. This seems to be the end of the line for Buzz and Woody. They finally agree. But unfortunately, what they agree is that being a toy is hopeless. And then suddenly, Buzz leaps into action. He hoists the milk crate off Woody, and the two of them join forces to get back to Andy. And what causes Buzz to shake off his despair is this moment of mirroring.
All I can do is, there's a snake in my boots. Why would Andy ever want to play with me when he's got you? I'm the one that should be strapped to that rocket.
This is the mirror moment that launches Buzz into action. Because when Buzz glimpses his own feelings of insignificance in Woody, he loses his sense of tragic isolation. He realizes that someone else feels exactly like him. And so he experiences a deep sense of sympathy that bonds him and Woody together. So if you want to create big sympathy in your next script, write a mirror scene like this. Have your main character see the reflection of his own condition in his great rival, finding a moment of sympathy, before he and his rival are snatched away to a fate that mirrors back the audience's own future doom. So that's how Pixar reverse engineered a script that creates big sympathy. Sympathy not with one person or two people or five, but sympathy with the entire human condition. If you want to do the same, copy Toy Story's blueprint. Create a story world with a deep human problem it refuses to acknowledge. Create two main characters who oppose that problem, one by denying it, the other by worrying about it too much. Create a comic, sentimental narrator who soliloquizes between joy and fear. And create a 5-part plot that carries the two main characters into conflict, then into a mirror reconciliation, and finally into a tragic shared destruction that the audience recognizes as their own. And Toy Story can offer you something even bigger than this blueprint for big sympathy. It can open your eyes to the vast storytelling possibilities that lie beyond the blind spots in the Hollywood widget machine. Toy Story reveals that you can leave behind the old formula of a 3-act structure to base your plot on a 5-act play. It reveals that you can leave behind the old formula of a hero's journey to tell a soliloquy story about 2 heroes. And it reveals that you can leave behind all the old formulas through a simple 3-step process. Step 1, listen to your audience, identifying their deepest fears. Step 2, identify a cognitive effect that helps the audience face those fears. Step 3, reverse engineer a script to create that cognitive effect. To help you reverse engineer, go ahead and look for inspiration in the huge library of storytelling blueprints that exists beyond Hollywood, like Pixar did with Hamlet. But don't hesitate to do what Toy Story did when it split up Hamlet's soliloquies between a pull-string cowboy and a plastic astronaut. Don't hesitate, that is, to innovate. If you'd like to write a script that creates big sympathy, here are a couple exercises you can try. First, make a list of difficult changes that people go through. Maybe some of them are changes you've been through yourself. Then, sketch a story where a character experiences this change, wrestling against it internally and externally, before at last finding a bigger community of individuals who've been forced through the change too. And then end your story by making the audience feel that the change is coming for them. Second, write a mirror scene where a character with a problem realizes that their biggest rival is facing the same problem, shifting them from opposed antagonism into mutual sympathy.